Hello, you're listening to Me and Paranormal You with your host, Ryan Singer. Because it's more fun to believe. Hey, everybody. Thank you for listening to another experience of Me and Paranormal You. This is your buddy, Ryan Singer. I'm very excited today because I'm talking to Dr. Vitka of Spellbound Tours in Salem, Massachusetts. We're going to get into some stuff. We're going to get into some paranormal investigation, we're going to talk some origin stories. We're going to sprinkle in some sideshow ghost stories. There's a lot to cover, and I anticipate that we're not going to get to it all in this conversation. So, I'm already calling it. There's going to be multiple. There's going to be multiple chats. I'm already calling it. Dr. Vitka, thanks for joining me, Mike. How are you today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. I always love talking to people, especially people who are also in the field of the supernatural.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a life to live, right? I mean, how long would you estimate you've been kind of in this world?
Well, let's see. I was always, even as a little kid, I was interested in paranormal topics. I was obsessed with UFOs. I was obsessed with ghosts. I was obsessed with freaks and things. I remember the school library had some books they probably shouldn't have had when I was like 5 years old.
Wait, let's not say that
It,
too loud.
in fact, what got me into it as a real little kid was this book called Bigfoot, America's Number One Monster.
Oh
And
my God.
I still remember the cover. It's a Bigfoot, and looking at it now, he looks kind of upset, but I remember seeing it as a kid and being horrified. He's got his hand up like over his head. I think the cover was a takeoff on the Minnesota Iceman story. And I picked up this book and I read it, and I seriously didn't sleep for days. Like, I lived somewhere that was somewhat rural, and I was convinced that there was going to be a Sasquatch out in our little suburban development. And from that point on, it just opened me up to everything weird. And it sort of remained on the back burner. Like, I grew up enjoying the X Files, enjoying the interesting stories, but I always looked at ghosts with something of a skeptical eye until I had a very intense and odd experience in Salem, Massachusetts.
I want to get into that. And I want to talk about this origin story of yours. And because for me, it's always a really fascinating, moment in time when at the intersection of, just kind of living your life and then something unexplainable happens. And it's one of those, knocked off your horse kind of situations by a bolt of lightning, so to speak. And some people have these moments too, but then they just continue living their life, and they're like, okay, that's not the path for me. I'm not going to be going into this paranormal world, right?
And those are the people who stay sane and successful.
Yes, those are the people who don't have a trouble or any trouble probably paying a mortgage. Meanwhile, the rest of us paranormal weirdos are still renting apartments. It is it is from what I was able to read and ascertain, before our chat. It looks like this origin story is a doozy, and so set the stage for us because you're talking. It happens in Salem. Were you living there at the time?
I was living in Salem. I had come to Salem to attend the university in Salem. Salem State University would not recommend it for academics, but I will tell you that the only paranormal investigation that me and my folks ever called off because it was too scary was at the old portion of that university.
Wow,
Salem State.
I'm having crazy deja vu right now.
It was wild. It was that part of the university which way back in the past used to be an old convent, but that's another story. So I was in Salem. I was in college. I liked paranormal stuff, but I wouldn't necessarily call me a believer at the time. And I got a job, just a regular summer job, working for a company. I won't say the name, but they were a company where everybody working there were lawyers, law students, professors, and students, not the kind of people who are typically prone to making up fanciful ghost stories. Unbeknownst to me, this office building was at the site where the witch dungeon from the Salem witch trials took place. So every time I went into work, I'd go into this bland looking modern building, go down some stairs, and we were doing our work basically right where people were being held and tortured in 1692.
Unbelievable. I
I didn't
mean,
know I didn't know the history, but one afternoon, me and my friend were just doing our thing, and we heard what sounded like heavy footsteps just going up and down the hall, just like thump, 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 thump. And we looked out, nobody was there. Then we saw some lights going on and off, back and forth, and each office that wasn't occupied was having the lights go on, go off, go on, go off. Nobody was in there, and we heard the footsteps recede into the distance. And that was weird, right? This happened every day we were there. And I just kind of brushed it off. It was strange and unsettling, but it's an old building, right? Years later, I learned that was around the time each day that allegedly the sheriff from the witch trials would go cell to cell and check on his prisoners and torture them. But it gets worse.
wait,
One afternoon,
real quick. I don't want to cut you off here, but when all of this was happening, were you aware of the history of the where you were, the location where you were at the time when
I
you
wasn't,
first started
no,
experiencing this?
I was not. I had a cursory understanding of what the witch trials were, what happened in the witch trials, that the witch trials was an important part in American history and still affected us today. You can't escape that legacy when you live in Salem. But I was not necessarily aware that the building we were in was directly on the footprint of where the dungeon was.
Wow.
So I didn't know that it was a historically significant location. And so one afternoon, my friend is sitting down at her desk. She gets up to stand. She's going to go to lunch or something. She stands up, and it looks like she's just forced right back down into her seat. She describes the sensation as she stood up, and it felt like two cold hands gripped onto her shoulders and shoved her down into the seat. She stood up again, and she was pushed right back down. She stood up a third time, and at that point, something slapped her across the face.
Oh my God.
I heard the slap. My friend screamed. A big red welt appeared on her face, and it looked like the impression a hand would leave if somebody was slapped really hard. Later, she described the sensation as being smacked and then getting a shock of electricity right through her body.
Holy.
And as I'm sure you know, there's a big correlation between paranormal activity and hauntings and electrical occurrences. So it totally makes sense that she would have had that shock sensation. She quit that day. She did not come back. I stayed for the rest of the contract, but at that point, I realized there was something that I wanted to continue to learn about. At that point, I started digging into anything paranormal I could. This was around 2002, so the field wasn't as open as it is today. It was a little harder to do the research, but from that point on, I started digging into the witch trials history, of course, and found out exactly what transpired at the location. I started looking into the science and pseudoscience of paranormal investigation. And that was what really set it off in my mind that there was something to move forward with. And from that point, I ended up meeting up with a woman named Molly Stewart, who at the time was one of the best paranormal investigators in the country. And I basically apprenticed with her. She was the person who owned Spellbound Tours back in the day before she retired and I took over. And it was training with her and having that shocking experience that set me down on this current path. That
Wow.
was 21 years ago this spring. How about that?
Wow. I mean, can you? I was, oh my gosh. Yeah, I was graduating college. About to graduate college, 2002. Embarking upon my stand-up comedy career. Um, you know, oh God, I mean, the Wayback Machine. It's,
Yeah, at
but
that
it's
point,
tough.
I think one of the only ghost websites that I could find back then was Shadowlands. Do you
Oh
remember
my
that?
God. Oh my God. Like, it's so funny because we come from this in from different angles, right? We've ended up at this moment in time together, and at the very beginning of this conversation, I even said it, I was having some intense deja vu, and the it's weird because I came from an angle where I had a crazy experience and I was doing my damnedest to try to find information on the internet. And we're talking to within the last 2 decades. You're right. It's so much more difficult to find anything. And I was specifically looking for things regarding shapeshifting and things like that. And there's just nothing out. There was hardly anything out there that you could find on the internet. And nowadays it's much more open, like you said, and which is great. But it's also we also need to, I think, refine our discernment to a certain degree. You referenced the science and paranormal investigation, and also the pseudoscience, and I think we'd be remiss to say that there's not both. Um, as people who love this, and it is wild though that something that 20 years ago has such a profound effect. It alters the course of your life, right? We're talking about something that even if it wasn't like, oh my God, selling the house tomorrow, I'm burning all my things, like I'm moving to somewhere, it still, even if it wasn't like such a drastic moment, like a theatrical moment, it clearly altered the course of your life forever, right?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't still be in Salem at the moment. Wouldn't be doing the best ghost tour in Salem. Wouldn't be collecting stories of the paranormal if that hadn't happened. And honestly, at this point, I'm almost more interested in why people believe and what they're seeing and feeling than if there's any proof to it. Like I felt like I went through a phase at one point where I really wanted to disprove, but now I feel more like, all right, you saw this. Why did you see this? And why does it matter to you? Like it's almost like the folklore is becoming culturally and emotionally more significant.
Yeah, the human experience. And there's a good friend of mine, Jim Perry. He hosts a wonderful show called Euphemet. I got to connect the two of you if you're not already connected. Um, anyway, it's we talk about this a lot, and it's one of his big things is what is the human experience? What is the paranormal's effect on the human, right? And in the individual basis, and what does it mean for our life moving forward? And that's fascinating that this is what you're talking about. And because for me, that's exactly what we're talking about here today. We're talking about a guy who had a job in Salem. Next thing you know, something supernatural occurs in a major way. It completely instantly changes the woman's life who you worked with, because she quit that day. Something tells me she didn't go into work that morning thinking, I'm going to quit my job. I just need an excuse. I'm going to act like a ghost smacks me.
Well, what
And
really cool what happened to her is she kind of had a little bit of a tough time after that experience. She couldn't really wrap her head around it. And now she is in the mental health profession. She helps people, and she kind of attributes that weird experience to putting her on the path to want to help other people who've had traumatic experiences.
that's really cool.
She's not like a ghost therapist or anything, but having gone through something traumatic and unexplainable herself made her eventually realize what she wanted to do was help other people who'd also gone through traumatic things.
That's
So
beautiful.
I guess something good came out of the witch trials after all.
Yeah, I mean, it took a while. It took
Which,
a while, but we
crazy
got
enough,
there.
it's still getting us now. Do you know much of the history?
I do know a little bit. Before we get into the history, I need to ask you something.
Of course,
But let's put a pin on that, or in that, or whatever people say.
a
Um,
witch's pin.
a witch's pin. What did young Mike want to do when he was like? What did you think your career path was going to be? I'm curious about this.
I always wanted to be in entertainment. I had fantasies of being a filmmaker like Ed Wood. Ed Wood was always a hero. Elvis Presley, just people who were entertainers but kind of did it their own way. Um, that was the kind of world I was aiming for.
Okay, and
And a big part of it, which I actually did achieve, was after I learned about sideshows, was I put pretty much everything else on hold, even my work in Salem, when I found out that these things were still actually out there. And I went and joined one of those, and I can say that that was one of the best experiences of my life. I spent about 5 full years traveling with, shows on the road, with freaks, wonders, oddities, and curiosities. Some of it was real, some of it was fake, but, it was really hard living, but it was also some of the most amazing, fun times I've had in my life. I was actually talking to a friend the other day, because I just recently turned 40, and I was kind of looking at stuff as one might, and I was telling him this is actually the guy who played the Weekly World News Bat Boy for my sideshow for a while. And I was saying, maybe I should have a midlife crisis, but I've already done everything fun.
You've already purchased your veritable, your figurative Corvette has already been purchased. Um, as a 46-year-old man, I can tell you that the midlife crisis it is something that, when you live in these worlds that we live in, it's like one might argue that we've been having a midlife crisis the whole time. So, like, I feel
Tell
like a
that to
mid.
all the action figures on my shelves.
Yeah, it's like what's a midlife crisis even look like for people like us? I think it's, oh, I need to get a 9 to 5er and get a mortgage. But okay, so and I do want to remember, because we alluded to it, or you and I, before we started recording, about a great paranormal sideshow story that I do want to remember to get back to. But before that, let's um let's get into the history of the witch trials and in Salem's history in general, because Spellbound Tours, obviously, it's a large component of everything that makes it so special to do to be doing this here in that location. And real quick, let's pause for a second here, or for a minute, and throw in some commercials. And you can listen to all these interviews commercial free at patreon.com/Ryan Singer, patreon.com/Ryan Singer, $3 a month, less than a Starbucks iced coffee venti, which is what I get with oat milk and sugar-free vanilla. That's like $5. So less than that, you get commercial free. So patreon.com, check that out. And thanks for the support over at Patreon. And we're back. I'm talking to Dr. Vidka of Spellbound Tours in Salem, Massachusetts. And we're having a great time catching up. We're talking about origin stories. Mike, you shared a really fascinating paranormal experience that happened at work, which is, I love daytime SPEs, spontaneous paranormal events. They fascinate. Those are my favorite, probably because people don't expect them when the sun's out. Um, in general, right? But now we're going to talk about Salem, and we're going to talk about the history and why Spellbound Tours is such a fascinating, undertaking. And we can maybe talk a little bit more about your mentor as well. Um, as you menteed underneath her on your journey into the paranormal investigation and the touring, and the and what that has meant for you in your life, because it's obviously a big part, right?
Oh yeah, of course. And to sort of piggyback on what you said about the daytime experiences, that's something I always like to let people know. Sometimes people pick the afternoon tour we offer because I think it's going to be safer during the day, that it's going to be less spooky. And what I always have to tell them is ghosts, whatever they may be, I take the approach that a ghost would be a spirit or a soul, something you or I, if we died, we could end up coming back potentially as what culturally we call a ghost, right? There's no arbitrary witching hour. Ghosts tend to haunt at times that things happen to them, things that were emotionally significant in their life, traumatic things that happened to them. Say you had a routine or ritual you do every morning at 6 a.m., you do it for 20 years, then you die. If you're one of those people lucky enough to come back as a ghost, it stands to reason you'll be haunting at 6 a.m. On the other hand, if you get murdered at midnight, you're probably going to haunt at midnight. So just because it's daytime doesn't mean the ghosts aren't out there. We're conditioned to think of them as a nighttime phenomena, but that's just because evolutionary, we think of night as a spooky time. Night was the time people were supposed to be inside. They were supposed to be insulated and asleep. And if they're out at night, something weird happens, it's going to spook them more. That doesn't matter to the ghosts. The ghosts are out doing their business when they would have been doing their business in their lifetime. So just, I like to tell people, just because it's day doesn't necessarily mean that we're safe.
Yeah,
So
the
be scared 24 hours a day.
always be afraid.
So where to even begin with Salem and the witch trials? One thing I think is really interesting is if you look at the history of Salem, even in pre-colonial history, Salem always had a reputation as kind of a spooky place. There were a lot of indigenous people around here, but generally they didn't want to hang out in Salem. There's a lot of records of trading and fishing, but when it came time to actually making permanent encampments, they preferred being elsewhere. There's a reason that most of King Philip's war between the colonists and the indigenous people happened further up in Maine. The natives looked at Salem, they're like, all right, you stupid white people, you want this part of the world? You want to take this area? Please, it's cursed. Salem always had an eerie reputation. If you look at Salem, even post witch trials, it's always boom and bust, boom and bust. Salem has had a consistent history of tragedy and things going wrong. I almost look at it, you know how some people believe that there were healing vortexes out in the world? Everybody, all the hippies talk about Sedona, Arizona, going there and feeling refreshed.
Yeah, I was.
Salem is the opposite of that.
Oh,
Salem,
wow. Okay.
if you want to believe in energy and vortexes and go off in that spectrum, Salem is a negative land. It's cool. It has a lot of positive energy to it because of the folks who come here now and make their home here who are involved in the witchcraft scene. And it can be a beautiful place for people to reconnect with their witchy roots. But on the whole, Salem's like a cursed kind of place.
Oh, wow. I mean, I've never I've never visited, and this makes me want to visit, but also makes me not want to visit, but also makes me want to visit. You know what I mean?
Salem is a phenomenal place to visit. If anybody is even slightly interested in paranormal stuff, they need to come to Salem. If anybody wants to learn about witchcraft or modern witchcraft culture, they need to come to Salem. Especially if you want to learn about the Salem witch trials and that dark time in American history, Salem is essential. But be careful before you decide to move here because a lot of people who come here with the best of intentions kind of go nuts once they make it their permanent home.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it makes me want to get on Zillow right now and start checking prices.
Well,
Um,
I'll tell you, the one place in Salem right now that is affordable is that office building on the site of the dungeon. If
it's for
you look,
sale, or is it apartment buildings now?
it's offices for rent. But if you look, doesn't matter whether you're looking for commercial or whether you're looking for residential, prices in Salem are through the roof. But if you want an office in the former dungeon site, you can get one right now.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, because people know better. It sounds like people locally, anyway, right?
Yeah,
Is that the case?
that is the case. Everybody who goes in there for the various services that are offered can't help but notice nowadays there's a little plaque right up front that says site of the old witch jail.
Wow. I mean, it sounds like a perfect place to have a paranormal podcast studio. Um,
You know what? If you have a satellite office in Salem, I would come and hang out all the time.
oh man, I mean, now that I got this office here in North Hollywood, I'm like, oh, okay, we go coast to coast with this.
Oh,
Like the
we're gonna get George Norrie in
yeah, we'll get George Norrie.
coast to coast.
We'll get a Ouija board, see what Art Bell thinks.
Oh boy, the favorite Ouija board in my collection. This was given to me. It was given to me at a Christmas party, and this guy who had met a couple of times. He heard about what I did, and he does electrical work and house cleanouts. And he rushed to his car and said, "Oh, you got to take this." And it was a Ouija board which he had salvaged from a cleanout. The folks who had him do the clean out. We're just like, yeah, get it done. Keep anything you want, do the work, but get all this stuff out. and he gave me the Ouija board. He said it felt like it had bad vibes or whatever. I took the Ouija board home. There was actually blood stains on the Ouija board.
Are you kidding? Blood
No
stains?
blood. It looked like human blood, and it's on the board. And I did a little bit of digging. Turned out the person he did the house clean out for was somebody who had become something of a shut-in and was just up in that room with his board way too often.
So
I
we're
don't
talking about a solo individual shut in um who owned this Ouija board,
he
and
owned the
there was
Ouija
bloods on
board.
it. There was
There was
blood
blood
stains.
on the board, and the man had recently, unfortunately, ended his life. And the board was found with a little bit of blood in his collection, just out there. And that's something which I have proudly in my collection of allegedly cursed artifacts.
Wow, that is now this story feels like it is ripe for, follow up, like on a almost on a deeper in a deeper level. But um I do love any kind of artifact like that we're talking about, cursed slash haunted, that has, I mean, obviously if it's going to be an object like that, there's always going to be an interesting backstory associated with it and a history. I'm curious when it comes to, you're talking about your collection here. So, um, are these how many items would you say are in your collection of like cursed slash haunted artifacts?
To be honest, I couldn't even count. I have so much weird stuff with me right now.
So is it just
uh,
something that just you just having to start picking up pieces here and there along the over the years?
pretty much, yeah. It sometimes I'll get a little souvenir from an investigation. Other times I'll be out and about and something just kind of calls to me. I remember we were doing some stuff over in the UK, and I picked up vertebrae, human vertebrae, and it is totally legal to buy and sell bones in the United States as long as they are having a proper provenance. It's a little bit stickier when you're bringing them overseas,
Yeah, I can
but
imagine. Like, hey, you got some
I've
human bones in your baggage. What's is this carry on, or is this can
well,
I
well, carrying like a corpse that's been picked over.
oh no, like carry on luggage.
That's like a pun,
Carrying
but yeah,
luggage. I do like that.
but I got the vertebrae and I was freaking out. I didn't know what to do with it because I remembered as I was going through TSA, they made me throw out my hair products. So how the heck were they going to let me bring a bone back in? And so frantically, the morning before we were flying back, I was sitting in the hotel just like sewing the bone onto my hat. And thankfully, they didn't catch it. I was sweating that whole flight because I
That's
had
an
a dead guy
interesting.
on my
That's a
head.
trick.
Yeah,
Make
just
it part of your wardrobe.
I don't know what they thought, but I just put the hat on the scanner and they let me and my new friend go right through. I also, one of my favorites is I have a full human skeleton, and it came from a former Oddfellows lodge. A friend of mine was at a yard sale, and he called me up early in the morning, and he knows that I like oddities and weird stuff. And he says, "I'm at Oddfellows Lodge. They're clearing it all out. They've got some masks and stuff." And I said, "Cool. Do they have the skeleton?" And he said, "I'm not going to ask if they got a skeleton. Like, just ask about the skeleton." And I went back to bed. He called me about 20 minutes later, like out of his mind. "They got a skeleton down here." And
Can
of
you?
course, the skeleton is so old that if you look at modern medically prepared skeletons, you can see that part in between the ribs is usually a plastic type material.
Yeah.
This guy, it's made out of human leather.
Oh my God,
So
human leather.
this goes back to the 1800s at least. And we know that during that time period, some of these skeletons were being uh, acquired through less than ethical means. So I don't know who this guy is. I found in his ceremonial casket, there's a little pin from a state fair in Illinois. So I think he traveled pretty far to get here where he is today.
Wow. I'm curious if you can illuminate us on Oddfellow lodges. Did you say lodge? Oddfellow lodge?
Lodge, yep. The Oddfellows was a group like the Masons. And basically, it was a place for guys to hang out and network. It was a place where they would do charitable works for the community. And the name Oddfellows comes because, the Masons, they started out as an organization for people who worked in the Mason trade. Oddfellows were for people who didn't have a particular career, let's say. It was for people who were of different professions, and they all organized together in the Oddfellows Lodge. They have the same kind of rituals that the Masons do. There's a lot of really interesting pageantry with masks and rituals and kind of unusual things. If you looked at it from a perspective of not knowing what was going on, you'd think it looked pretty creepy. Basically, they were just guys who hung out and did good work together, but they masked it in unusual symbolism. So it looks creepy. Personally, I think it looks cooler than Masonic symbolism. It's very like hardcore looking stuff like linking chains and eyeballs and all that.
Oh, okay, interesting. I'm trying to remember now. I think a buddy of mine, Matthew Jackson, was actually talking about maybe getting a skeleton from an Oddfellows lodge as
Yeah.
well.
One of the
Um,
things in the ceremony is when you were being initiated, you had to confront death. And nowadays, when you confront death in a lodge, usually you're confronting it with a replica skeleton. But back in the old days, you'd be all blindfolded up and you'd feel the bony hand come at you. You'd have to kiss the bony face, and the blindfold came off and it was an actual skeleton. Something I'm sure I'm bastardizing the ritual, but basically you face death and you were looking a real formerly alive person right in the face.
wow.
But
And
they
I
were they
mean,
were basically just guys who hung out and did good work together. And of course, like every group out there, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about them, but they had some of the coolest symbolism of any of the fraternal orders.
that does sound really cool. And as someone who was in, when I was in college the first time, I was in a fraternity. I was in a fraternity called Delta Tau Delta, and I eventually rose up to a position of like I was in charge of like you know membership development and like so programs, rituals, all that kind of stuff. And we had these rituals that we'd have to go through every once in a while, these ceremonies, and quite frankly, none of us knew what the hell what most of it meant, other
Were these
than
just passed on from brothers from generation to
yeah, just from
generation?
really old, or is I think I want to say 1858 is when
Okay.
I can't believe if that's the real date, I'm going to be shocked that I remember that a bit. But I mean, as a pledge, these things are like really burned into you. I think 1858, if I'm not mistaken, was the beginnings of Delta Tau Delta fraternity, and so the rituals and ceremonies would go back that far. And then so we had these pamphlets and we'd be reading these things and saying all these words, and we'd be wearing like robes and stuff. And most of us didn't really know what most of it meant. But there was a ceremonial, there was a ritualistic aspect to it that for whatever reason, it had an energetic resonance that
Hmm.
bonded us together. Even if we didn't fully comprehend the ritual in which we are performing or participating, we felt a connection to one another, and it would strengthen our bond, I guess, theoretically, and I think it actually would over time. And I
Oh,
still,
I totally believe that.
yeah.
Yeah, the
Now,
shared experience.
yeah, there wasn't like virgins being sacrificed or any of that kind of crazy stuff. Sure, we had secret handshakes and we had like, code things to do to try to confirm whether or not someone was actually in the fraternity or not. If they said they were, then you'd have to go through like a series of very subtle tests and answers that were like nonverbal and verbal. But anyway, it was a lot of pageantry, right? And which I
I'm not going to
love.
do the Mason handshake, but are you the widow's son?
Or yeah, something like that, right? Yeah, I mean, I am fascinated with all that stuff, and I keep telling myself I'm going to try to get into the lodge here and where I live now in Glendale, California area, because it's not too far from me. Um, and I know a few Freemasons, and there doesn't. I don't know. Anyway, we're getting off track. I do want to
Yeah,
circle. I want to circle
oh, of
back to
course, of
the
course.
history of Salem a little bit and how it ties into the work you're doing with Spellbound tours and stuff. Real quick, let's do one more quick little pause here for some for a commercial because I think this is going to go a little longer just because there's so much to talk about. So patreon.com/Ryan Singer. That's where you can go and listen to all of these without commercials. So let's take a quick break here and throw in a couple ads. Keep the lights on at the watering hole. And we're back. Okay, so I'm talking with Dr. Vitka. Mike, this is we're going all over the place. There's so much we can talk about. There's so much we can cover. We haven't even touched on your history, in the sideshow world, the oddities and the curiosities, which is, really, really fascinating to me as well. There's so much overlap with the paranormal and cryptids and the supernatural and sideshows. But I want to get into a little bit about the Spellbound tours and the work you're doing there. When people come to Salem and they're obviously hyper fascinated with and interested in the dark history that's associated with the location and how that ties into the work you're doing with Spellbound tours.
Well, something that is, I think, important is obviously when you come to Salem, like I mentioned, very dark history, a lot of tortured past. Nowadays, it really makes sense that the people from the witch trials are still going to be haunting because consider the stuff they endured. A lot of times, a haunting connects to something really important and traumatic and heavy that happened in a person's life. These people suffered so much during the witch trials, and they also suffered so much during their lives. I mean, they were the Puritans, who I'll explain in a minute, but every waking minute of their life was fear and misery. And then they had even more fear and misery from the witch trials. They died in a horrible fashion, and we've never been able to let them go. There are 73 different tours in Salem right now. When Spellbound started, we were the only one in Salem that was actually run by real paranormal investigators. In fact, Molly, the woman who founded the company, was a member of the International Ghost Hunter Society back in the day. And I really think it makes sense that the witch trial people are not at rest because we keep poking at them all day long. Some people tell the true stories, some people tell made up stuff, but they're still being invoked 24 hours a day. And I can just imagine how I would feel if I'd gone through all that suffering those people did, and even now I wasn't let to rest. Like a lot of times in a regular haunting, what I've discovered is once we're able to pin down who the ghost is, it almost seems like it just wants to be recognized. In many cases, once we do the library part of the investigation, which is the most fun, and we can confirm who the ghost may be, it kind of relaxes. These witch trial people don't get that luxury because they're still being raked through the mud, deservedly and undeservedly, every single day. Like they're not going anywhere, in part because people like me aren't leaving them alone.
Yeah.
And in the case of people like Giles Corey and Sheriff Corwin, that's totally deserved. But in the case of people like, say, Rebecca Nurse, I feel like we should let her be a little bit. But so, yeah, the people who were involved in the witch trials were the Puritans. Now, the Puritans were Christians, but not the type of Christians that we're supposed to think about today. Not like any of the nice Christians. These guys were so strict, they make the Westboro Baptist Church people seem normal by comparison. They believed in predestination and they believed in a literal devil. Like when you were born as a Puritan, you were from conception going to heaven or hell. And you didn't know if you were going to hell or not. So you had to adhere to Puritan doctrine every second of your life, or else you'd be damned. But you didn't know if you were saved either. So you were living in that constant stress that even if you knew that you were the best Puritan out there, you might not make the cut. So they had that stress. They were also, they believed in witchcraft, they believed in devils. They didn't think of the devil as a concept. They didn't think of the way that a lot of folks today think of the devil, like a hands-off, tempting idea. They thought the devil was literally hiding in the woods to tempt them and get them. And they were also constantly fighting with the indigenous people who were in Salem and the surrounding area. They were constantly having trouble with the home country of England. They were living a scared, high stress existence. It was the coldest winter on record. They barely had any food. Life as a New England Puritan really sucked so much. And when the witch trials exploded, they leaned into it because they finally had an excuse to let loose a little. They also finally had a scapegoat for all the stuff that was making their life miserable.
Wow. It
So it was like
is,
a
yeah.
perfect firestorm of misery. And what set the whole thing off was there's a guy named Reverend Paris. Now, Reverend Paris was a failure at every single thing he did. He was basically what we'd call a trust fund kid today. He burned through his family money and he thought he could make a lot of money as a plantation owner in Barbados. He was a failure as a plantation owner, so he thought that he could make money as a minister. And so he moved to Salem. And when he moved from Barbados to Salem, he took his family and the enslaved people who had to work for him from Barbados with him. And one of the people he had as a slave was a woman named Tituba. Now, Tituba is the center of the whole witch trials. Normally, today, when people think of an enslaved person in the New World, the image we have in our mind is a person of African descent, right? Not Tituba. She was an American Indian. She was from the Arawak tribe in South America. She got captured, she got sold into slavery, and she ended up on Reverend Paris's plantation in Barbados. And while she was there, she worked alongside the enslaved African population and she started to absorb their culture. She started to do things their way. And that sort of synthesized with the beliefs she'd had from home. But then when the slave owner, masters came around, the slaves had to cover all that stuff up and pretend that their rituals were to really honor the Christian saints. And that combination of Christianity, African spirituality, and indigenous spirituality, all that blended together, blossomed into what nowadays we would call voodoo. Tituba was almost certainly practicing voodoo before that faith was even named. And it's ironic she was doing that because she was the slave of the minister. And so in Salem, we've got big failure, strict Puritan Reverend Paris. His slave Tituba is supposed to be taking care of the kids. And to entertain the kids, she's telling them these wild folklore stories. She's telling them all these things that she knows from her past. She's doing it as entertainment. She's doing it to make friends with the kids and to do her job and not get in trouble. She's keeping the kids busy by telling them stories. But the kids, they feel really guilty about it because of their strict Puritan upbringing. They know that they should not be listening to this kind of wild stuff. But the guilt keeps eating up at them and eating up at them and eating up at them. And of course, they get caught. And who do you think the first people who get caught are? The Reverend's daughter and the Reverend's niece.
Hmm.
And they freak out. They start twitching and shaking and speaking in tongues. And nowadays, we know that stress can elicit physical symptoms. We call it hysteria. But back in 1692, they couldn't figure this out. They saw the kids were acting weird, and their mind went straight to witchcraft and demonic possession. And so, with a little bit of coaching from Reverend Paris, the girls realized that as long as they leaned in and said, "Oh, yeah, we're possessed. Witches are making us act," not only would they not be in trouble, they'd finally be able to act out and be kids for a little bit, and they wouldn't have any serious repercussions. Other people in the community saw this and ran with it and started making false accusations to get back at people they didn't like.
Yeah,
And
it
of
really
course,
it was a wildfire.
like another layer on top of that, too, is even though greedy, selfish people were using the witch trials framework to get back at their enemies and steal land and money, they also really believed in the existence of witchcraft and the demonic hand.
Hmm.
And that's how it totally exploded. That's sort of the quick version of what set the witch trials off.
Well, it's really a perfect storm of so many things. And inside that storm, or the result of that storm, are so many innocent people who suffered and
There, there were
unspeakable things.
19 men and women got executed. Giles Corey, who everybody knows about, he was the one who got painfully pressed underneath the rocks during his interrogation. He died. That brings the total up to 20. There were a couple of people we know of who died in the dungeon, and probably the saddest fact of all, in my opinion, is that two dogs were killed.
Hmm.
But
Dogs who were possessed, witch dogs.
you want to hear the dog story? It's
I
probably
mean,
the dumbest thing the Puritans did.
yeah, I do. I do. I'm always looking for more dumb things Puritans did.
So, and bear in mind, this did not come from the mind of Tituba, who was probably a voodoo practitioner. This did not come from the mind of anybody who identified as a witch. This came from the mind of a good, staunch Puritan woman. She had the idea that to ferret out who the witches were, to figure out who was afflicting the girls, what they had to do was bake a witch cake and feed it to the dogs. You know the witch cake idea?
I don't know the witch cake.
The idea is that you would take a special cake, feed it to the dog, and the dog would lead you to the witch, and then you could kill the witch.
Oh my
To make
God.
this cake, you would get one of the girls who was afflicted by the witch, get her to urinate in the cake batter.
Oh my God.
Then they would bake this cake, basically like a pea pancake, and feed it to the dog, and then the dog would do its thing and ferret out the witch. Obviously, these dogs got the witch cake and they got sick. And because the dogs were sick, that meant they were just covering up for the witch. Because the dogs did not immediately go sniffing out the witch, that meant the dogs were acting as witches' familiars and protecting the witch, and the poor dogs had to be exterminated too.
I mean, if these powers would have been used in other ways, right? I mean, as far as, I mean, talk about getting creative with it. Um, and, but like you said, I could only imagine the oppressive just reality of
It
everything
was
in that
so
time.
incredibly stifling for everybody.
And it's just like, who thought this was a good idea? I mean, like, you know, and it's like you said, it's like people in power can use things to control other people. You know, this guy was a failure, and he starts, doing anything he can to try to get power of some kind, whether it's money, land, slaves, um, and just to be in a position of power. And and then when everything starts hitting the fan, this is a great release valve for all that tension, like you said, in the perfect storm of everything. And now everyone gets really, really creative with how they can chip in
To
and
get
feel like they're a part of it.
to give you a little insight into the psychology of Reverend Paris, he was where the witch trials started, right? If you look at his personal correspondence, there are more letters where he's pestering the powers that be in town to give him firewood for his church than there are letters of him talking about the witch stuff. For his whole career, here he is as the spiritual leader of this community. And yeah, he's concerned by the witch explosion, but he's more concerned about making sure he gets his firewood and his money.
Wow.
But the sort of silver lining, cool thing about the witch trials, my favorite part of the whole story, and I always make sure to tell her story, is Tituba. Because through the years of doing investigation and giving tours, we've discovered stories about just about every single one of the people involved with the witch trials. It seems like almost every one of those people is still haunting us in one way or another. I've also met a ton of people who can go back and trace their family history and genealogy to people who participated in the witch trial, both the accusers and the victims. In fact, the other day we had somebody on the tour who was directly related to Sheriff Corwin, and they were shocked when they found out what a jerk he was in real life. And of course, we've also met people who claim to be reincarnated from witch trial victims. Now, I've probably met 15 to 20 different people who say that they're reincarnated from Bridget Bishop. I might have believed one of them, but 20 is a little hard to swallow.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
nobody has ever seen Tituba's ghost. Like nobody's ever reported a spiritual interaction with Tituba. Nobody has ever traced their genealogy and found a convincing link to her family line. And nobody has ever tried to claim that they've shared her past experience. Tituba is the only person from the witch trials who really seems like she was able to find peace after it was all done, which I think is really cool.
That is cool. And yeah, I mean, this is a really fascinating timeline. And I mean, talk about a convergence of things where you're talking about Tituba's past and history and, what amalgamation and, and the creation that came, potentially from it. And these these stories and, you know, in actual history, it makes me think about haunted history and how potentially maybe it's an untapped resource being able to, you know, at least as far as the real world is concerned, being able to tap into and utilize storytelling from the great beyond
Mm.
to get a clearer understanding of what actually happened in the past. And obviously there's all kinds of reasons why people would be like, well, this is, you can't expect us as a world to just agree that a history book can be written by the stories told to people from ghosts. But the idea of such a thing is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would say that I would like to read more history books written by ghosts.
Yes,
I feel like they have a
yeah.
valid perspective on what happened.
I definitely agree with you 100% on that. Now, let's uh let's talk a little bit. We haven't even talked about Spellbound tours, and we're getting closer to that time here,
Oh boy,
where we're
I
going
could
to be
do this
wrapping up.
all day
I
if
know,
you
and we're
wanted.
gonna have to revisit, and we're gonna have to do it in person. I'm gonna have to get to Salem. Maybe I'll try to do it at the end of the summer or at some point, or
Oh
maybe
yeah, you just
fall would even be better. But um, let's talk
let
about
me know.
Spellbound tours. Are yeah,
I've got tickets waiting whenever you want to come.
okay. I love it. I don't. Is there a, and there's probably usually when I travel, like I like to tie in like shows, like to do a like a a comedy show or something like of that nature, just to try to cover expenses and stuff. So I've never performed up in that area. I need to get up there. That would be a fun time. And then,
Oh yeah,
but let's talk about the tours. Let's not worry about
sure,
my
yeah.
career. That's not what we're here to talk about today. Let's talk about Spellbound tours and what's going on with it.
What do you want to know? I can
Well,
tell you.
you don't have to give me the brochure pitch, but um, I'm curious about like locations in which the tour takes people, and are we going to? Does it involve the office space that used to be the dungeon or the jail?
It certainly does. That is one of the highlights of our site. I'll tell you, we start at the Salem Visitor Center, the National Maritime Historic Site, and we walk past one of my favorite places. I'm not going to say the name because depending on who's in the office at the time, they like to talk about it. They don't like to talk about it. We stop at a church that's built on top of a cemetery, which is really cool. That's one of my favorites because some of the folks who are actually used to be associated with that church would call us up all the time saying that they'd seen and experienced really weird things in there.
Oh, that's cool.
Basically, it's a beautiful old New England church. Some of the pews in the church date to the 1700s, and it's built directly on top of a cemetery. And it's also on land that was owned by one of the witch trial participants. One of the real highlights we go to is the stop where Giles Corey actually was pressed to death.
Oh my gosh.
Probably the thing that most people know about the witch trials, even if you've only seen the Crucible or watched that Drunk History episode, which, by the way, I swear those guys took the tour with the way they did their delivery. But where Giles Corey basically, for a number of reasons, refused to enter a plea of innocent or guilty at his trial. So rather than let him go or just force him to trial, they had to adhere to the law. And if you weren't going to enter a plea, you were going to have a plea tortured out of you. And the most cruel, scary, gruesome torture they could think of was called pressing. The idea was a person would slowly be compressed under enormous weight. And normally, if somebody was pressed, if even the idea of pressing was invoked, they would confess immediately. There was only one other case of oppressing even being threatened in American colonial history. And that woman immediately confessed as soon as they even brought the idea up. Giles Corey, the obstinate old crank he was, said, go ahead with the pressing. He suffered under thousands of pounds of weight for 3 days.
Jeez.
And we go to the site where he was pressed. We actually have people stand right where I believe he breathed his last breath under all that weight. And his final words as he was dying, he said, at least according to the folklore, he said, damn you, Sheriff Corwin, I curse you and all of Salem.
Wow. And
And
there you have it, right?
people say they still get a very eerie feeling there. And the curse has been borne out. Just about every sheriff in Salem since then, up until nowadays, has died prematurely from heart attacks or blood disease. Like if a bunch of people see Giles Corey, it's a tragedy for the entire city. One of the best sightings of him happened in 1914, and just hours after people claimed to have seen his spirit, the whole city burned to the ground.
Oh my
We
God.
had we had a more recent experience there. Somebody who worked for me said they got a sensation that as I was telling the story about Giles Corey, they said it felt like their chest became heavy and they couldn't breathe. They said it felt like constricting hands around their throat, and they got the mental impression that Giles Corey was very upset we were telling these stories. The next time I called my friend to see if he wanted to come back and work again, his family said that he had just dropped dead. There were no medical conditions leading up to it. He was a healthy guy. And shortly after he claimed to encounter Giles Corey, he was no longer with us. So the Giles Corey stop is always intense. Then we go to the dungeon, of course, which is where I had my experience. We go to where Bridget Bishop had made her home. We point out, of course, the building that Hocus Pocus was filmed in, because you can't go to Salem and not think of Hocus Pocus. Um, One of my favorites is we talk about vampire legends and folklore. I love those stories. That's where it gets really bloody. Uh, if people are into serial killers, I talk about two different serial killers who came to Salem, the Boston Strangler, and of course, everybody's favorite, Carl Panzram. We go to the cemetery. We point out where Houdini didn't escape. And at the end of the tour, everybody gets to take a look at some amazing photographs from the past 20 years of our paranormal investigations. Now, it's really cool because obviously I see alleged ghost pictures almost every night. I've looked at thousands of ghost pictures, and most of them almost immediately get discarded. They're lights from the camera, their lens refraction, their precipitation, their people, trying to play pranks in the shadows. But there's a handful of pictures. And if you want, remind me, I can email you some really startling, convincing, dare I say, shocking ghost pictures I cannot disprove. And I always love to see the look on the faces of the audience when they get to see the pictures. Because sometimes seeing the pictures is almost as good as having an experience themselves.
I'd love to see those 100%. I love that. I would love that. I mean, I've probably only over the years gotten my hands on, I don't know, maybe 10 video slash photos that just they leave me unsettled. I can't wrap my brain around and are seemingly beyond the shadow of any doubt for me. And those moments are those moments are beautiful when you can find a piece of evidence like that. 100%. I'd love to see
So,
those.
one of my all time favorites was from, because as I mentioned, I love antiques and oddities. I found an old personal family photo album from just some random family out in Arizona. And flipping through the pages, one of the pictures just gave me chills. It was a photograph that looks like a handmade outdoor barbecue oven thing. And sitting right in it is what looks like a classic shrouded ghostly picture. I bought the whole album just for that one picture. And when I extracted it, there's a little handwritten note on the back of it that says, like, and you can tell by the shaky handwriting, the person who wrote it was probably pretty disturbed when they saw the picture. They said something like, we didn't make this. And
Oh.
it's just so chilling to see.
Oh, I love a
And it
note.
was just in a photo album, which was normal stuff. It was happy families celebrating the holidays, people's vacations and pets and stuff. And then there's this really grim looking see through figure just sitting in the fireplace.
That is creepy. That's in my that's right up my alley.
Like that's
That
the sort of thing I love.
Yeah, there's I think you said it. I mean, I agree with you 100%. Some of these photos and videos, the evidence is so compelling that it is almost as if you're there, having the experience yourself. And those are like the Hall of Fame paranormal evidence things that we're talking about. And there's not a ton of those out there, that's for sure. Um, Mike, this has been great. I've been talking with Dr. Vitka of Spellbound Tours in Salem, Massachusetts. I cannot wait to get up there and meet you in person. And oh my God, I feel like, and I could be wrong about this, but I get the sense that you'd be a fun person to go get Philly cheesesteaks with.
Oh, sign me up.
Okay, I knew it. I knew it. I just sensed it. I'm like, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I think we would enjoy going to get Philly cheesesteaks.
I could
Um,
go for one right now.
I know, me too. I'm getting hungry thinking about it. All this paranormal talk gets me hungry. This has been a lot of fun. Spellboundtours.com is the website. That's where you can find all the information that you might need. And you can see how to set up a tour, how to have Dr. Vitka take you around and show you all that really cool stuff that he just described for the tours. I got to tell you, the idea, I mean, I don't know, there's very few places, if any, at least in the United States, that hold such a paranormal allure and have such a dark and sordid past associated with them that are beyond the shadow of any doubt verifiable as far as like history of events. I mean, a lot of places will have, they have a pretty good like reputation of like, oh, there was some awful stuff that happened here, and that's why there's so much activity. But a lot of it is speculation and or maybe stories. um, but I also love this idea too of haunted history being told by the the victims of the witch trials and things like that, and piecing together the history and the stories that would otherwise go untold unless paranormal investigators were searching and trying to reach out and have a two-way street of communication. To me, that's a really fascinating aspect of the paranormal field, especially moving forward as we keep pushing the field a little bit further and a little bit further into the future. I think that will be hopefully a large component of what paranormal investigation is all about. And so I love that we got into that in this conversation because it's not something I'd really put much thought into previously.
That's one thing which I will give the Puritans a lot of credit for is they really did believe in science. Their version of science was junk compared to modern science, but they believed in it. They also believed in the spiritual side of things. And obviously, as we talked about, their version of spirituality was horrifying and evil, but they didn't make that much of a separation. Like, if you look at the texts that came out immediately after the witch trials, even after people had been reeled back and realized just how mistaken they'd been about the whole thing, they still held to their truth that there were things out in what they called the invisible world. They did believe in the existence of both the hard facts and the supernatural stuff that couldn't necessarily be physically documented, but there was more than enough proof that people were experiencing it.
Yeah. And, conceptually, I'm 100% on board with that, with the idea that both can exist. I think we could even refer to it as the material and the immaterial coexisting together. And there's definitely, I think, plenty of reason for us to believe that these things do coexist simultaneously with one another. And how we define those and what personality we ascribe to those, and then the rules therein that follow that we make, that we think these invisible forces require of us, that's a whole nother shit show that I just don't understand.
Yeah. So we can put the skeletons in the boxes, but we don't want to put the ghost in the boxes because they've got their own agenda.
Wow, yeah, that's beautifully said. Well, Dr. Vitka, this has been great. Uh,
Oh,
I appreciate it. Is there anywhere else you want people to be able to find you, like on social media or something that I left out?
sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I love talking. I'd love to come back anytime. I've got a great story about how we accidentally stopped a murder from happening in the course of a paranormal thing.
Oh my
Uh,
God.
brand
Yes.
new, brand new cryptid just got reported to me about a month ago. Still got to do the sideshow story. So bring
Oh
me
my
on back.
God.
I'll
Yes.
chat your ear off. So
Okay, we'll make this happen soon.
we've got Spellbound Tours on Instagram. There's Spellbound Tours on Facebook, which I almost put it there, and spellboundtours.com online. That's the best place to get tickets, the best place to get in contact. If you send an email, it goes directly to me. I try to answer everyone. Sometimes it takes a while, but I do try to look at every picture that comes through. I'd love to hear your ghost stories. And if you want tickets, if you want to get in touch, spellboundtours.com. Also, if you're in Salem, if you haven't bought a ticket online, you can always run into a really cool shop called the Magic Parlor. That's where our ticket office in person is. I
Oh,
recommend
cool.
buying tickets online, but the Magic Parlor is an awesome place just in general, and it's a place where you can get last minute tickets.
Awesome. That sounds great. Um, okay, well, cool. So all over the place, easy to find, highly recommended. And I look forward to doing this again. And to all those people listening, if you're listening to this on the day it comes out, I'll be at Indianapolis at the Middle Ground Comedy Festival headlining the show tonight. So at Black Circle Brewery or Brewing Company. I hope to see you there. If not, I'll see you, you know, at the watering hole on the astral plane. Thanks again, Dr. Vitka. This has been great. I look forward to doing it again.
Well, thank you so much. I was happy to be here.